Dear Speaker and MIT Professor Emeritus, Madame la directrice du Laboratoire de recherche sur les asymétries d'interface et professeur de linguistique à l'UQAM, distingués invités, Mesdames et Messieurs, chers amis, à titre de recteur de l'Université du Québec à Montréal, je suis très honoré de prendre part à cette conférence présentée par l'un des plus grands intellectuels de notre temps. How can one introduce Noam Chomsky? I think it is humanly impossible to list all the contributions of this eminent linguist, father of generative linguistics, and father of the cognitive revolution. Of this prolific writer, whose bibliography contains close to 1,000 titles, and who remained the living author most frequently cited in the arts, the social science, and the humanities. Of this renowned scientist, winner of the Kyoto Prize, in some sense equivalent to the Nobel Prize, who has received endless honors, including 39 honorary doctorates. And to which must be added, of course, of this fighter for causes as a critical, committed intellectual through more than 50 years of history and political events. Limitations of times and the fact that you are an informed audience, however, are not my only reasons for abandoning a panegyric eulogy. It is also because Noam Chomsky himself, during his long and prolific career, has always shied away from anything resembling to a cult of personality. In the tradition of Wilhelm von Humboldt, he believes that achievements, discoveries, and new knowledge are the result of collective efforts, which, in order to bear fruit, requires unwavering commitment to the search of truth and place that offer the freedom to pursue it. Freedom of thought, freedom of speech, freedom to teach, freedom to carry out unbiased research, and freedom to exchange ideas across borders, whether disciplinary or territorial. In other words, academic freedom. At a time when universities are facing pressures on their independence and autonomy, it is good to have friends of the caliber of Noam Chomsky. La conférence qui nous réunit aujourd'hui est une occasion d'apprécier, et de la manière la plus stimulante qui soit, les réalisations extraordinaires que permet de générer le milieu universitaire comme lieu favorisant la pensée critique, l'audace intellectuelle, les débats et les échanges d'idées. Maître d'œuvre de l'événement, la professeure Anne-Marie Dichoulot a sans contredit porté ses valeurs. D'une part, en accueillant régulièrement des conférenciers d'envergure, la professeure Dichoulot participe activement au partage et à la diffusion des savoirs. D'autre part, c'est grâce à ses recherches de pointe et aux collaborations qu'elle a développées durant sa carrière à l'UQAM et notamment aussi avec le MIT que nous pouvons profiter de manière très privilégiée aujourd'hui de la présence de Noam Chomsky. Je tiens donc à la remercier chaleureusement, de même que les membres de son équipe du Laboratoire de recherche sur les asymétries d'interface et du Réseau international de biolinguistique qui ont contribué à faire de cet événement un succès. Finally, I thank Professor Chomsky for accepting this invitation. As a rector, but even more, as a professor of neuropsychology, as one of the founders of UQAM Institute of Cognitive Science, and as a fervent defensor of open innovation, it will be a great privilege for me to hear him share his thought on language and its purpose. À vous toutes et à vous tous, je vous souhaite une excellente conférence. Merci.
J'aimerais remercier le recteur, M. Pro. J'aimerais aussi saluer le vice-recteur de la recherche, Guy Moffett, et Mme Marie-André Roy, vice-doyenne à la recherche. Je vous remercie de votre présence. Avant de laisser la parole à Noam, je ne peux pas m'empêcher, parce que je suis quelqu'un de très enthousiaste en linguistique, les gens qui me connaissent le savent, et j'aimerais souligner l'importance des travaux de Noam, et en particulier ce qu'il a fait tout au long de sa vie. Au siècle dernier, il a fait un changement de paradigme et il ne cesse de contribuer au développement des connaissances sur le langage. Alors aujourd'hui, nous voulons lui rendre hommage, et moi en particulier, je voudrais lui rendre hommage parce qu'il a mis de l'avant un paradigme qui intègre le principe de parcimonie, qui est un des principes importants en sciences. Alors ça rend la linguistique très proche de la science avec ce principe de parcimonie après moi. Et aussi, il a contribué à l'essor de la biolinguistique, alors qui a commencé dans les années 50 avec des philosophes, des biologues, des psychologues, Lenenberg, Piaget, Monod et Massimo Piattelli-Palmerini. Dear Noam, your contribution is outstanding to our knowledge of language, and I'm glad that you accepted our invitation, and we're honored by your presence, and I invite you to present your talk.
Thanks very much. I'd like to outline a few things that I think we can say with a certain degree of confidence about the essential nature of language, about what language is in its most fundamental aspects, and why the answer to this matters, not only for inquiry into every aspect of language and its use, as ought to be obvious, but hasn't been through the years, but also more fundamentally, more deeply into the question of what kind of creature we are. What I'll say is personal. I should make this clear at the beginning. My own perspective. There's no consensus on this, and my own views, in fact, are a minority view in the whole range of related fields. There are quite a few. There is consensus on one matter. From the second half of the 20th century, there's been a huge explosion of inquiry into language by any measure you take. There's far more penetrating work into a vastly greater array of typologically varied languages than was ever conceived in the past. Many new topics have been opened. The questions that students are working on today could not have been formulated, in fact, even imagined half a century ago or even more recently. And new problems and puzzles are constantly coming into view more rapidly than old ones are being at least partially resolved. Those are all very positive signs, I think, of an exciting array of interlinked disciplines. I have my own reservations about some of them, which I'll return to a little bit as we proceed. Well, I think it's fair to trace this sharp and unmistakable change in the study of language in large part to new options that became available by the middle of the 20th century. Options for considering more seriously than had been possible in the past the most fundamental question about language, namely, what is it? By then, by the mid-20th century, advances in the formal sciences had enabled a clear formulation of what we should recognize to be the basic property of language. I'll refer to it from here on as just the basic property. That is that each language provides an unbounded array of hierarchically structured expressions that receive interpretations, dual interpretations of what are called two interfaces, the sensory-motor interface for externalization and what's called the conceptual intentional interface for mental processes, for thought, planning, and so on. If we can formulate that, it allows a substantive formulation of classic dictum about language, goes back at least to Aristotle, that language is sound with a meaning. Although our work of recent years shows that sound is much too narrow, and in more subtle ways, I think the classic formulation is misleading. I'll return to that. Paying attention to the basic property it follows at once that every language incorporates a computational procedure which satisfies the basic property. And therefore, by definition, a theory of language is a generative grammar. That's a matter of definition. There should be no debate about it. And each language is what is technically called an I language. I stands for internal. It's internal to an individual, and intentional with an S. That means we're interested in the actual nature, the actual character of the computational procedure, and not just some set of objects it enumerates, what it strongly generates in technical terms. There's another notion, those of you familiar with the field will know there's another notion, weak generation, which some people, not me, call E-language. But whatever that is, I don't think it's anything. It's a derivative notion, if it's even definable for natural language, which I doubt very much. These are topics that were discussed extensively in the 1950s, but a lot seems to have been forgotten. Well, accordingly, the various approaches to language should recognize that each language is a property of an individual person, internal, mostly to the mind, the brain. That's nowadays called the biolinguistic framework. It should be uncontroversial. It should also be recognized as a prerequisite to other inquiries, which proceed to numerous other questions that we can raise about acquisition, use, origin of languages, about language in society, and about the internal mechanisms that implement the system. And here there's a dual question that implement both the system of knowledge and its various uses. These are different, though, of course, related tasks. Well, evidently, the investigation of these further topics relies necessarily on guidelines that are provided by an answer to the question of what language is. Now, that shouldn't be controversial either. So, for example, no biologist would propose an account of the development of the eye or the evolution of the eye without first telling us something fairly definite about what an eye is. It's truism, and the same truism should hold of inquiries into language. Unfortunately, it often doesn't, but it should. In earlier years, the basic property resisted formulation, clear formulation. So I'll just run through some of the classics to illustrate. Take Ferdinand de Saussure, one of the founders of modern linguistics. For him, language had several notions, but language in the relevant sense is a storehouse of word images in the brains of a collectivity of individuals, sociological notion. It's founded on what he called a sort of contract. For Leonard Bloomfield, leading figure in American linguistics, language is an array of habits to respond to situations with conventional speech sounds and to respond to these sounds with actions. Elsewhere, he gave a different definition. Language is the totality of utterances made in a speech community. It's something like formulation in another classic, William Dwight Whitney, late 19th century linguist, conceived of language, as I'm quoting again, the sum of words and phrases by which any man expresses his thought, hence what he called audible thinking. That's actually a slightly different conception in ways that I'll return to. Well, if you have conceptions of this kind, it's quite natural to follow what Martin Jost, well-known linguist of the 1950s, called the Boasian tradition of Franz Boas, which holds that languages can differ arbitrarily and each new one must be studied without preconception. Actually, rather similar ideas were held at the time about biological organisms, but no longer. If you take this point of view, then it's reasonable and natural to consider linguistic theory to be simply a set of techniques of segmentation and classification applied to some body of data, corpus of data. The most sophisticated development of this conception was Zelig Harris's Methods in Structural Linguistics about 65 years ago. The shift of perspective to generative grammar within a biolinguistic framework opened the way to much more far-reaching inquiry into language itself and also into language-related topics. That's the basis of the explosion of the last 50, 60 years. It also greatly enriched the variety of evidence that bears on the study of each individual language. It includes what you learn about acquisition, neuroscience, dissociations from other cognitive capacities, much else, and also what you can learn from the study of other languages, not in the traditional view, but now in this framework it does, because of a very simple and quite well-confirmed assumption, namely that the capacity for language, the human capacity, relies on shared biological properties, and there's pretty good reason to believe that these haven't changed in any detectable way for at least 50 or 60,000 years since humans started leaving Africa. That's the topic of what's called UG, Universal Grammar. It's a contemporary adaptation of a traditional concept. There are also broader reasons to be concerned with the question, what is language? There's a very clear indication of these, and it's given in a very recent book by one of the leading scientists who studies human evolution, Ian Tattersall. I'll read his words in a recent review of the currently available scientific evidence. He observes that it was once believed that the evolutionary record would yield early harbingers of our later selves. The reality, however, is otherwise. It's becoming increasingly clear that the acquisition of the uniquely modern human sensibility was instead an abrupt and recent event, which he dates in the narrow window of roughly 50 to 100,000 years ago. Evolutionary point of view, that's a flick of an eye. And the expression of this new sensibility, he goes on, was almost certainly crucially abetted by the invention of what is perhaps the single most remarkable thing about our modern selves, namely language. Accordingly, an answer to the question, what is language, matters greatly to anyone who's concerned with understanding our modern selves. And it does appear, as he says, that our modern selves, from a cognitive point of view, did emerge pretty suddenly in that brief window and hasn't changed since. The founders of modern biology, of course, lacked the evidence of current science, did nevertheless adopt a fairly similar view. So Darwin wrote that man differs from animals solely in his almost infinitely larger power of associating the most diversified sounds and ideas, which means in modern terms having a generative grammar. The phrase almost infinite is a traditional phrase. It's to be interpreted today as actually infinite. There's no meaning to the notion almost infinite. Much earlier, at the origins of modern science, Galileo was entranced by what he called that marvelous invention that provides the means to construct from 25 or 30 sounds that infinity of expressions that enable us to reveal everything that we think and all the movements of our soul. That's audible thought in Whitney's phrase, although Galileo went beyond by recognizing the unbounded character of language, its infinite character. The same recognition, along with a much deeper concern for the creative character of the normal use of language, that was soon to become a core element of Cartesian science. We now call it philosophy. It's the same thing in those days. There's no reason today to doubt that the fundamental insight of Descartes, in fact the basis for his famous mind-body theory, fundamental insight that use of language has a creative character. As he pointed out, it's typically innovative without limits. Use of language is appropriate to situations, not caused by them and not random, which is a fundamental distinction and one that goes beyond anything that's understood in contemporary natural science, which is restricted to determinacy and randomness. But language, as Descartes pointed out, seems to escape those limits, the normal use of language, and can engender, use of language can engender in other people thoughts that they recognize when they hear it that they could have expressed themselves. And that's the creative element of normal language use. We should also bear in mind that a well-known aphorism of von Humboldt, that language involves infinite use of finite means, refers to use. More fully, he described the unending and truly boundless domain of language as the essence of all that can be thought. Basically identifies language and thought. That puts him in the tradition of Galileo and others who associated language with thought, while it does formulate one traditional conception of language as the single most remarkable thing about our modern selves, in Tarasol's recent phrase. Well, there has been great progress over the years in understanding the finite means that make possible infinite use. But the latter, in particular its creative character, remains a mystery, maybe permanent for humans, but in any way today no reasonable idea about how to grasp it. Despite considerable progress in understanding conventions that guide appropriate use, different but related topic. Go back a century ago, another well-known linguist, Otto Jespersen, raised the question of how the elements of language come into existence in the mind of the speaker, on the basis, of course, of finite experience, though it's an infinite object. And somehow it yields what he called a notion of structure that is definite enough to guide the speaker in framing sentences of his own, crucially what he called free expressions that are typically new to the speaker and the hearer, and indeed over an unbounded range, essentially Descartes' insight. And then the task of the linguist is, first of all, to discover these mechanisms, determine how they arise in the mind, go beyond to unearth what Jespersen called the great principles underlying the grammars of all languages. It's universal grammar in contemporary terms. And by unearthing these great general principles, to gain a deeper insight into the innermost nature of human language and of human thought, which again, in traditional style, he identified. It's another version of the traditional conception that language is the most remarkable thing about Homo sapiens. In fact, it's fundamentally unique characteristic. These are ideas that sound much less strange today than they did during the structuralist behavioral era, behavioral science era, that came to dominate linguistic, psychology-related fields, marginalizing all of these insights and the tradition from which they derived. But they're now reviving, leaving us with fundamental mysteries, but at least some understanding of how to approach them. Well, to reformulate Jespersen's program, the basic task is to investigate the true nature of the interfaces and the generative processes that relate them, and to determine how they arise in the mind, how they're used, the primary focus of concern, of course, being free expressions, not frozen ones. As soon as the earliest attempts were made to approach this topic, to construct explicit generative grammars, about 60 years ago, right away many very puzzling phenomena were discovered. which had never been noticed in the thousands of years of intensive study of language, because the basic property had not been clearly formulated and addressed. And in fact, syntax was simply regarded as use of words determined by convention and analogy. All of this is somewhat reminiscent of the earliest moments of modern science. So for millennia, scientists had been satisfied with simple explanations for familiar phenomena. So rocks fall and steam rises because they're seeking their natural place. That was the explanation for millennia. Objects interact because of what were called sympathies and antipathies, which draw them together or push them apart. We perceive a triangle or any form because its shape literally flits through the air and implants itself in our brain, so on. Those were the answers, and regarded as satisfactory answers. Galileo and others allowed themselves, really for the first time, to be puzzled by these facts. And at that point, modern science begins. It was quickly discovered that our beliefs are mostly senseless and our intuitions are mostly wrong. That's what happens when you allow yourself to be puzzled about what seems simple. And in fact, willingness to be puzzled is a very valuable trait to cultivate. It goes early education up to advanced inquiry. Well, one puzzle about language that came to light about 60 years ago and remains alive, and I think highly significant in its import, it has to do with a very simple but quite curious fact. So take the sentence, instinctively, eagles that fly swim. Okay, there's an adverb. Instinctively, it's associated with a verb, but interestingly, it's associated with swim, not fly. Okay, and obvious. And the same is true if you ask a question like, can eagles that fly swim? It's a question, but you're asking about swimming, not flying. The thought that it fails to express, there is a thought that it fails to express because of this, that's pretty difficult to formulate. You might try without quite complex circumlocution. It's a fine thought, but hard to express. It impedes communication. One of many such examples. I'll return to more. Well, what's puzzling is the association of the clause initial elements, instinctively or can, with a verb that's remote, and an association that's based on structural properties, hence hard to compute, not proximal, and based solely on linear properties. It's a far simpler computational operation. So somehow language automatically picks a complex structural notion of distance, not a simple linear notion of distance. That should be puzzling. In fact, it was never regarded as puzzling, but it should have been. It's kind of like objects going to their natural place. It turns out that language makes use of a property of minimal structural distance, never using this much simpler operation of minimal linear distance. And the puzzle is why this should be so, not just for English, but for every language, not just for these constructions, but for every relevant construction. And of course, in all of these cases, the data for the child acquiring language is either ludicrously small or mostly non-existent. Well, there is a simple and plausible explanation for the fact that a child reflexively knows the right answer in the cases I mentioned, never makes any mistakes, even though there's essentially no evidence, sometimes none at all. The simplest explanation would be that linear order is simply not available to the language learner who's confronted with such examples. The learner is guided by a principle of universal grammar that restricts search to minimal structural distance. Actually, I know of no other explanation that answers it, and there's good reason for it, but there's no other explanation. Well, this principle of minimal distance is quite extensively employed in language design. It's presumably a special case of a much more general principle that enters into the design and acquisition of language, a principle which we might call just minimal computation. Systems designed in such a way, it is a computational procedure, but it's designed in such a way as to be the simplest one possible, minimal. Now, that principle in turn is probably, presumably, an instance of a far more general property of the organic world, and in fact even beyond. And the evidence shows that invariably languages make use of minimal structure rather than minimal linear distance in every relevant case. Actually, in this case, which is interesting and unusual, there's also supporting evidence from neuroscience. There's a research group in Milan, including, as the linguist is Andrea Moro, who many of you know. The group studied brain activity of subjects who were presented with two kinds of stimuli. One category was, they were both invented languages. One category was invented languages that satisfied the principles of universal grammar. The other category was invented languages that violated some of those principles. So, for example, in the latter case, it could be a rule for negating a sentence that put the negative element after the third word, let's say, instead of the much more complex rule for human language. Well, what they found is that in the case of conformity of the invented language to universal grammar, they found normal activation in the standard brain areas, the language areas, though when they used linear order, which is much simpler computationally, that was not the case. The example was treated, some people could solve it, but it was treated as a non-linguistic puzzle with diffuse activation in the brain. There's also work by Neil Smith and Yanthi Maria Simpli, who work with a cognitively impaired but linguistically fluent subject, and that reached the same conclusion. Well, that strongly supports the idea, which we find overwhelmingly in actual linguistic work, that linear distance just isn't used, even though it's the simplest computational procedure. Now, there actually is a small industry in computational cognitive science which tries to show that these properties of language can be learned by statistical analysis of massive data. Every attempt that's clear enough to be investigated has been shown to fail irremediably. But there's something much more significant. The efforts are beside the point in the first place. So suppose they succeeded, which is a virtual impossibility, but suppose they did, they would leave untouched the only serious question. Why does language invariably use the computational property, the complex computational property of minimal structural distance, and never use the simpler computational property of minimal linear distance? Just count, easiest thing. Well, this is incidentally a good example of the unwillingness to be puzzled that I mentioned earlier. This is contemporary cognitive science, refuses to be puzzled about simple things, and that's going to prevent the development of science, just as it did before Galileo. That's the first step. If you can't be puzzled by phenomena like this, doesn't matter what you find, it's not going to be relevant. There's a broader thesis, and that is that linear order is never available for computation in the core parts of language that involve syntax and semantics, how sentences are understood. It would follow then linear order, of course, exists, but it would follow that it's a peripheral part of language. And that's easy to understand. It's a reflex of properties of the sensory motor system. Sensory motor system just requires it. We can't speak in parallel. We can't produce structures. All we can do is produce strings of elements, say strings of words. That would, of course, also include the order, there is order found within lexical items. Of course, you do find linear order within lexical items, but lexical items are the most familiar form of externalization, of relating, of mapping to the sensory motor system, so it presumably reflects that. In linguistics, it's called Saussurean arbitrariness, the arbitrary association of sounds with some arrangement of sounds with concepts differing from language to language. The sensory motor system is not specifically adapted to language in quite fundamental respects, maybe any respects. The parts of the sensory motor system that are essential for externalization of language and also for perception, they appear to have been in place hundreds of thousands of years before language pretty suddenly emerged. And in fact, if you take a look at languages, the domain in which they are extremely complex and highly variable is externalization, the relation of the internally generated, semantically interpreted structures to the way they're pronounced. When you learn a second language, that's what you study. You don't study the other part, in part because nobody would know how to teach it. It's a scientific question to discover it. And if you tried to teach it, it would just confuse people because they know it already. It's part of their nature. Well, if this is, the matter isn't totally settled, such matters never are, but I think there's considerable support for the broader thesis. And if that's true, then the basic property is not exactly as I formulated it before, and as it is formulated in almost all the literature, including recent papers of mine. Rather, the basic property has to be restated fundamentally. Basic property is generation of an unbounded array of hierarchically structured expressions which are associated with the semantic-pragmatic interface, conceptual intentional interface, basically the system of thought. Interesting questions about the nature of that association, I'll put that aside. But the externalization, what reaches your ears, is just something peripheral to language, ancillary, tacked on. If that's true, and it seems to be, there's pretty good reason to revive a traditional conception of language as an instrument of thought, and indeed to revise Aristotle's dictum accordingly. Language is not sound with meaning, but meaning with sound attached to it. More generally, some form of externalization seems to be modality independent. Typically it's sound, but not necessarily. If you think about it, the externalization of language is very rarely used. By far the most use of language, almost close to 100% of it, is internal. It's kind of internal dialogue. It's what we call talking to ourselves. You can't avoid doing it. Every minute of the day, you're somehow talking to yourself, in fact, while you're asleep, unfortunately. And that's almost all the use of language. In comparison, and statistically speaking, the externalized use is kind of trivial. Now, there hasn't been a lot of research into this, unfortunately. There should be, and it could be. But what the limited research on the topic seems to illustrate, it conforms to what introspection suggests, at least my introspection. You might try it. When you pay attention to what's going on in your mind, when you think you're talking to yourself, it seems to me, and a few other researchers have looked into it, that what reaches consciousness is not expressions, just small fragments, fleeting fragments. And they instantly appear internally. And then full-formed expressions do appear, but far more rapidly than it's possible for articulators to be involved, or even instructions to articulators. And often they're not produced, even internally. A common experience is to say something, even to yourself, and realize that that's not what you meant, and then try to reformulate it, which means there's something that you meant, and you're not capturing it in what you're trying to articulate. And what appears in consciousness is just some fleeting array of things that's probably superficial to the mind. I think that's an important fact. Well, putting aside that topic, which could be investigated, I think it isn't investigated because of a dogma that identifies consciousness with thought. And that's probably completely wrong, though it's a hoary tradition, and by now virtually dogma. Well, putting this aside, it's an interesting topic. Investigation of the design of language gives pretty good reason to take quite seriously a traditional conception that language is an instrument of thought. Externalization is an ancillary, peripheral process. It's a reflex of independent properties of the sensory motor system, which is quite independent of language. Further investigation supports this conclusion. I'll mention a few things. If it's established, it follows that particular uses of language, say for communication, anything depending on externalization, is even a more peripheral aspect of language. Now, that's contrary to virtual dogma in all the relevant fields that has no serious support and I don't think can be sustained. It would also follow that the extensive speculation about the now fashionable topic of origin of language is on the wrong track to begin with. It almost always is the study of origin of communication, which is quite a different topic. Well, and incidentally, a misleading topic, because if you study origin of communication, there is continuity with other organisms, or there looks like there's continuity. So every organism, down to bacteria, has some kind of communication. So that can lead people, I think mislead them, into thinking that human language is just an outgrowth of a long process of natural selection. If, on the contrary, language emerged suddenly, the way Tattersall argues, I think accurately, it's not going to be anything like that. And that correlates with what apparently is a pretty strong conclusion that communication is a very peripheral part of externalization, and externalization itself is a peripheral part of language, an ancillary part, kind of tacked on. I think there's evolutionary reasons for thinking that too. We'll come back to it briefly. Well, let's return to the basic property. Now I'm reformulating it. The computational system of internalized language yields an unbounded array of hierarchically structured expressions connected to the conceptual, intentional, semantic, pragmatic interface. There are ancillary processes which may or may not externalize it in some sensory modality, similar observations about perception of externalized language. Well, naturally, we follow standard scientific method. We seek the simplest theory of the basic property. That is the theory with fewest arbitrary stipulations. Note, incidentally, that every arbitrary stipulation is a barrier to some eventual account of origin of language. And we ask how far this standard principle of scientific method can carry us. There is, if you think about computational systems, there is an elementary operation, which is the simplest computational operation that's found in some manner in every relevant computational procedure. What it does is take two objects, call them X and Y, which have already been constructed, and it makes out of them, the two of them, a new object, call it Z. Call that operation merge. The principle of minimal computation, which governs biological systems, language in particular, dictates that neither X nor Y should be modified when they're merged to form Z. And that it also dictates that they should appear unordered, because ordering is a further complication. And that's a conclusion that's justified and plausible on independent grounds, as I've just discussed. Well, if you think about it, that means that merge of X, Y simply forms the set consisting of X and Y. Now, that, of course, doesn't mean that the brain contains sets. some current misinterpretations are disturbed by that. It means that whatever is going on in the brain, and we don't know, has properties that can be characterized in these terms, just as we don't expect to find, say, a Kekulé diagram for an organic molecule in a test tube that describes some of the properties of whatever you find there in an abstract way. Well, suppose X and Y are merged, and neither is part of the other. They're two separate objects. So say you're combining a read and the book, or whatever underlies them, to form the syntactic object that corresponds to read the book. That's called external merge. Suppose that one of them is part of the other. Say Y is part of X. So in combining, say, which book and John read which book's part of the second one, you merge them, it's going to form which book John read which book. Now that's what's going on in the mind. It's going to surface externally as which book did John read by further operations that I'll return to. That's an example of a ubiquitous phenomenon of natural language, displacement. The phrases are heard in one place, but they're interpreted both where they're heard and in some other place. So in this case, the sentence that comes out, which book did John read, is interpreted something like which X, such that X is a book, John read the book X. It's a quantificational expression. Has to be understood in both places. Well, in this case, too, the result of merge is again the set X, Y, but there are two copies of Y. One is the original one, which remains in X. The other is the copy, which is merged to it. That operation is called internal merge. There's a kind of a temptation to think of merge as being asymmetric. You're merging X to Y, not Y to X. But that temptation should be resisted. It's a completely symmetric operation, just as you would expect for minimal computation. The temptation arises from the way we tend to think of generation, kind of anthropomorphically. We think of it as a process, kind of the way people think of, say, a proof in mathematics. You think of it as something you do step by step. Of course, it's not the way it works. The formal system, say an axiom system for arithmetic, it doesn't have any asymmetries of this kind. It just generates a geometrical object called a proof. It doesn't tell us anything about how to construct a proof. And when you're actually doing it, of course, you don't start from the axioms and go down to reach the theorems. Those notions have to be sharply distinguished. And the same is true of generating an expression with merge, other operations if they exist. These two kinds of merge, external and internal, are the only two possible cases if merge is defined in the simplest possible way, namely applying to any two syntactic objects that have already been constructed with no further conditions. It would require stipulation to bar either one of these. That's a very important fact. For many years, it was assumed, by me too, incidentally, that displacement is a kind of a strange imperfection of language, strange fact that has to be explained away by more complex devices, more complex assumptions about universal grammar. That turns out to be incorrect. Displacement is what you'd expect on the simplest assumptions. Actually, it would be an imperfection of language if it were lacking. Sometimes it's suggested that external merge is somehow simpler and should have priority in design or evolution. Again, absolutely no basis for that belief. They're just both there or neither is there, period. In fact, you could argue that internal merge, displacement, is simpler if you think about it. It involves vastly less search of the workspace for computation. Another important fact is that internal merge in its simplest form, that is, satisfying the overarching principle of minimal computation, it yields the structure which is appropriate for semantic interpretation. Just illustrated that in the case of which book did John read, where you have which book John read which book, which is exactly the way it's interpreted. as a quantified structure with a variable. Well, that's the wrong structure of the sensory motor system. Universally in language, only the structurally most prominent copy is pronounced, as in this case, lower ones deleted. Actually, there is a revealing class of exceptions which in fact support the general thesis, but I'll put that aside. Why do you delete copies? Well, that follows from another application of the principle of minimal computation. Deletion of copies means less computation for both the organization of the motor system and in fact for the articulators. So you're cutting back computation, and that's eliminating copies. Notice that that's independent of semantic interpretation, which keeps the copies. This is all part of the peripheral connection to the sensory motor system. Well, there's a result. The result is that the sentences that are articulated have gaps, something's missing. And the hearer has to figure out where the gap is. That's not easy. Those of you who've worked on, who have some background in psycholinguistics will know that that's the most difficult problem of perception and parsing, figuring out where the gaps are. If you didn't have deletion, it would be pretty easy. You'd hear them, but you do because of minimal computation. So in this broad class of cases, also, language design favors minimal computation. It disregards the complications in language use, which are just not relevant to the design and nature of language. Well, there are more complex cases, but time's kind of short, so I'll say they're very interesting, more complex cases. I'll drop them. But just as in the simpler cases, like instinctively eagles that fly swim, it's absolutely inconceivable that some form of data processing, analysis of large amounts of data, could possibly yield these outcomes. The relevant data are simply not available to the language learner. So the results must come from some genetically determined property, in our terms, that's universal grammar. And from inquiry of that kind, you can derive quite far-reaching and firm conclusions about the nature of language capacity, of universal grammar, common to humans, common human property, and quite striking in its character. So I think what we conclude, you do read in the literature pretty commonly, those of you who know it, that there are no genuine linguistic universals. Sometimes it's said there's no universal grammar. That's some kind of misinterpretation. The reference is presumably not to universal grammar, the genetic basis for language, which can't fail to exist other than magic, but rather it's a reference to something different, to generalizations which are largely valid. And many of these are quite interesting. In the linguistic literature, there's a category of generalizations presented by Joseph Greenberg years ago, famous universals, and they're quite interesting. But generalizations are very likely to have exceptions. They can be quite valuable as a stimulus to inquiry. You expect generalizations to have exceptions because they're kind of on the surface of much deeper properties. And so, for example, the standard in the sciences, so 19th century, there were discoveries of perturbations in the orbit of Uranus, planet Uranus. Now, that didn't lead to the abandonment of Newton's principles and Kepler's laws, or to the broader conclusion that there are no physical laws. It's, in fact, what's commonly done in the cognitive sciences and linguistics. Rather, it led to the postulation and later discovery of another planet, Neptune, which explained the violations of the generalization. And in fact, exceptions to largely valid descriptive generalizations play a similar role quite generally in the sciences. It's happened repeatedly in the study of language. Well, putting a lot of this together, we conclude then, I think, that if language is optimally designed it will provide structures that are appropriate for semantic interpretation, but that yield difficulties for perception, for communication. And there are many other illustrations of that. So take, for example, the operation of forming passive sentences. Say, the boys read the book. If you want a foreground to emphasize the phrase, the book, you passivize it and say, the books were read by the boys. The literature claims that that's it provides that as evidence to show that language is well designed for communication. But if you think about it, it shows the exact opposite. The principle of minimal computation bars innumerable cases of that kind, which would be quite useful for communication. So suppose you say, take the sentence, the boys read the book in the library, and you want to foreground the library. So if language was designed for communication, you would say, the library was read the book in by the boys. But that's unintelligible, that's gibberish. The reason is the principle of minimal communication, if you really work it through, does not allow you to express the thought that you have in mind without complex circumlocution. There are many examples, quite interesting examples of conflict between computational and communicative efficiency. And I think in every known case, anyone I'm familiar with, computational efficiency prevails. Ease of communication is just sacrificed. It's not a factor. There are many familiar cases like structural ambiguities, so-called garden path sentences, many others. One case of particular interest is what's called in the technical literature islands. So it's illustrated, for example, for those linguists among you, for ECP constructions, those that you find, and take a sentence like, they asked if the mechanics fixed the cars. You can ask a couple of questions about that. You can ask how many cars or how many mechanics. So that gives how many cars did they ask if the mechanics fixed, or how many mechanics did they ask if fixed the cars? Obviously differ radically in status. The second one is a fine thought, but you have to produce it by some circumlocution. Again, that impedes communication. If you think through the examples, it again turns out to be a case of minimal computation. Actually, here too, there appear to be counterexamples. So if you speak, say, Italian or Spanish, you'll notice that you don't get the contrast there. Recognition of those exceptions led to further discoveries about what are called null subject languages, first by Luigi Rizzi, then others. But the end result was to just reinforce the principle, just like Neptune and perturbations in the orbits of Uranus. Well, there are plenty of similar examples. Unfortunately, they really haven't been looked at until quite recently, but by now there's quite a store of them. And insofar as they're understood, the structures result from the free functioning of the simplest rules that yields difficulties for perception, difficulties for communication. But again, where there are conflicts between communicative and computational efficiency, in every known case, communicative efficiency is simply sacrificed. That lends further support to the revision of the common sense Aristotelian dictum and support for another traditional conception of language as an instrument of thought with externalization and ancillary process, a fortiori communication, other uses of externalized language, what's actually observed. Actually, that conclusion conforms quite well to something that's known in the advanced sciences. It was stated succinctly by a Nobel laureate, Jean-Baptiste Perrin. He pointed out that the essential art of science is a reduction of complex visibles to simple invisibles. And that's what we seem to find when you look closely at the basic property. All of this also fits quite well with the very limited evidence we have about the emergence of language, apparently quite recently, very suddenly in the evolutionary time scale, as Tattersall discussed. Kind of a fair guess for the moment is that some slight rewiring of the brain, we don't know enough about the brain sciences to detect it, but some slight rewiring of the brain yielded merge in its, and of course in its simplest form. There would be no reason for it to appear in a complex form. So it would be kind of like, what you'd get is something kind of like a snowflake. This is the way the laws of nature work. You get something that's perfectly designed in that sense. That would provide the basis for unbounded creative thought. Also what's called, there's a kind of a great leap forward, it's called, found in the archaeological record, roughly in that brief time period, say 75,000 years ago. And in fact, the remarkable differences that separate modern humans, both from their predecessors and from the rest of the animal kingdom. Well, I think that's what the evidence seems to indicate to us. These remarks, of course, are just scratch the surface, a lot more to say. But I hope they at least serve to illustrate that the answer to the question, what is language, matters a lot, and also to illustrate how close attention to very fundamental questions can yield, which look technical, but close attention to them can yield conclusions with a great many ramifications for the study of what kind of creatures humans are. Thanks.
We'll have a period of questions. So if you want to ask questions in English or...
Are there mics out there?
Yes, there will be mics. People will... please take the ones... There's a question there? Yes.
Hi, Mr. Chomsky. I'm a student at McGill, and I have a few questions to ask you. My first question is, how do you see the field of linguistics changing in the next 50 years?
Pardon?
And
how?
How? How do you see the field of linguistics?
The field of linguistics changing
in the next 50 years?
In the next 50 years?
Yes, and...
Fortunately, I won't be around to answer.
And my second question is, what changes would you like to see in particular?
What changes would I like to see? Well, what I would like to see, and I kind of hope it goes in that direction, I think the trajectory is kind of in that direction, but who knows, would be to demonstrate that language really is like a snowflake. I mean, actually, there are two different kinds of views you could have about the nature of language if you think about evolution or in general construction and formation of natural objects. One comes from a very correct picture of how evolution works over a long time scale. A great Nobel laureate in biology, François Jacob, once described evolution as what he called bricolage. It's tinkering. Natural selection kind of plays with whatever's available and does the best it can with what's around, and it keeps going. It can't go backwards, so it can't decide, well, it would have been better to do something else. And the things that you end up with are often pretty complex and pretty badly adapted to what we think of as their function. Almost every human being knows this. That's why you have back problems. The spine is just very badly designed. Any decent engineer could construct something much better. And actually people who've been through operations, if they work, do end up with something better that's engineered, didn't derive by natural selection. And that's quite natural if you think of long, slow changes through natural selection with small increments. It's sometimes called hill climbing. evolution tries to go up the hill, but may get to a point where it would have been better off if you'd climbed a different hill, but you're stuck. You can't do that. So that's the normal situation for tinkering, bricolage, for complex systems that develop through natural selection over a long period. There is another model, snowflakes, and things, other natural objects like them. They just emerge in a perfect way, fitting the laws of nature, period. So they're perfect relative to fundamental laws of nature. And in fact, a lot of it is just laws of mathematics. Well, which one is language? Or which picture is a more reasonable guess for language? Almost universally, the first one is assumed. There's by now a huge, I mean, this is true traditionally, but also there's a big literature on what's called evolution of language, which universally accepts that. I think it's just wrong. And I think if you think about what probably happened, sudden emergence within a very narrow time scale, again, that's a flick of an eye in time, and no change since. That we can be pretty confident about. What suggests is that it's really like a snowflake, and we ought to be able to show that. So what I'd hope for in the next 50 years is to say 50 years from now, somebody will be giving a talk here saying we've shown that language is perfectly designed by principles of physics and fundamental principles of biology, probably meeting simple mathematical conditions like minimal computation. And of course, that would mean there's a vast complexity of language. Everybody knows that from trying to learn a second language, but that would be just something peripheral, tacked on in the effort to externalize it, which an externalization, remember, means it's a cognitively difficult task. It means matching two different systems that have nothing to do with each other. And whatever it is that suddenly emerged in the mind and gives you what's sometimes called a language of thought, a way of expressing your thoughts to yourself, maybe, and some other system, the sensory motor system, which had been around for hundreds of thousands of years, has nothing to do with language. Matching these can be done in many different ways. It's easily subject to change, varies all the time, hard to learn. When you learn a second language or when an infant learns a first language, it's mostly that they have to learn, maybe entirely that. The core part they don't have to learn because it's just part of our nature. It's genetically determined, finished, perfect snowflake determined by laws of nature. Now, that's what I'd like to see in 50 years, but it's up to people like you to find out if it's true.
A related question, isn't it time to decolonize language studies from linguistics and from your puzzlements?
Decolonize language?
Language studies in general from those puzzlements.
Decolonize language studies from linguistics.
Language studies? You mean studying German or something like that?
No, language studies in general, including ethnopoetics to dialectology to diachrony to all of that.
Diachrony? Well, on the contrary, I think, it depends if you want to just collect the data, then you don't care. Like you could study botany without worrying about biology. You could collect flowers. If you want to be a flower collector, the best guide is not a biology book, but a wild flower guide. And collecting flowers is fun. I like to do it too. So you walk in the woods, you want to identify the flowers and the birds or something. You don't want a biology text. That's not going to help you. It's just going to confuse you. So it just depends on what your interests are. If you want to understand diachronic change, you'll want to know what the fixed bounds are on the possibilities for language. And the same if you want to study acquisition of language, language use, language teaching, anything else. On the other hand, for practical purposes, many practical human purposes, it might not matter much. Take, say, a teaching. So it's like somebody's trying to teach swimming. A swimming coach does not give the person instructions on fundamental physiology. There are complicated things going on in swimming, like how do you raise your arm? That's not simple it's pretty complicated. But you don't teach somebody that when you're teaching them how to swim, because that they know, because they're human beings, and that's just part of their nature, so you don't teach it to them. And what you teach them is the things they couldn't know, like how you move your head to one side, or to keep from swallowing too much water, or something like that. And it's the same with language teaching. Most of what's involved in acquiring a language, nobody's ever taught. An infant isn't taught, second language learners aren't taught, and it would be impossible to teach it, partly for the reason that we don't really know what it is, except partially. And if you did know, as I said, it would just confuse people, like trying to teach a kid learning how to swim, how to move his arm, or how to teach a basketball player how to go like that, You don't teach them that. So I think the answer to your question is just what your interests are.
There's another question.
Hi, Mr. Chomsky, I'm very honored to be here tonight. And I first had the book of yours in my hand some 40 years ago. It was the Strutture della Sintassi that our friend here must know, in Italian. Can you... okay, and I'm very touched by the snowflake model, which I think it's a very simple model. Nevertheless, a model like that can make for a big pine forest. Somehow, I don't know if the angle is the same, but the pine forest grows a bit the same way snowflakes do. And my question here is relating to the first question. Somebody asked you about your ideas about linguistics in 50 years. I'm more concerned about human languages in 50 years. I just attended a conference in Ottawa a few weeks ago where there was about the 60 Canadian languages. They were saying there maybe just 3 would survive. I have a more optimistic view of it, and I'm work a bit for that as a volunteer. But I'm just wondering, how do you feel about all this linguistic data and the fact of maybe sometimes it is archived, but how about the evolution of all these languages that are now brought together with the new situation, new media we have of communication?
Well, disappearance of languages for linguists is just a tragedy. You're losing irreplaceably a massive amount of potential data that you could learn something from. It's like destruction of species for an etymologist or something. It's a tragedy. But I think it's also a human tragedy, because disappearance of language is not just the loss of a language. I mean, a language is a repository of cultural wealth, of historical wealth, of oral tradition, of ways of thinking, of customs, and so on. And all of that is just a loss for humans altogether. We're losing part of our heritage as human beings, and of course for the people involved it's a greater loss. And it's undoubtedly going on very fast. In fact, we usually think of Aboriginal languages as being lost quickly, which they are, but some of the fastest and most radical language loss is going on in Europe, which we don't think of much. So if you go back, say, 100 years or 200 years, or even 50 years in, say, Italy, people were speaking a variety of different languages, which are mutually unintelligible. They're called dialects, but that doesn't mean anything. They're just totally different languages, and they're disappearing very rapidly. There are plenty of people in Italy today, say, who can't talk to their grandmothers because they talk a different language, which was called the dialect of Italian. In French, it happened too a little bit earlier, German as well. Actually, I had a graduate student, the linguists here will know, who was he did his dissertation on German, New German. Well, he wanted to go teach in Germany. So he did. He got a job teaching in Cologne. His job was to teach German to German students, because what they spoke, their language, was some other thing. It was what's called a dialect of German, but it was mutually unintelligible with German. That was 40 years ago, I guess. You go to Cologne today, you don't hear a word of it. It's just standard German. And that's happening all over Europe. You don't see it too much in the United States, some, because it's a very homogeneous society. But yeah, that's a serious loss. Incidentally, it's not irreparable loss. There are some cases where languages are being recovered. One of the most striking examples actually is Basque, which under Franco was repressed. And, you know, somebody's grandmother spoke it up in the hills, maybe. But now it's the national language. You go to Wales, Cardiff, let's say, and walk in the streets. Kids are coming out of school talking Welsh. It's just revived, reconstituted. Catalonia is something sort of similar. And there are even cases, one really dramatic case, I think it's a model that others are now pursuing. It was actually in my department. Ken Hale was a really remarkable linguist. He, together with a woman from the Wampanoag tribe, which was a tribe that was one of the main languages that was spoken in New England back when the colonists arose. It's been gone for 100 years, not a single speaker. But this woman, Jenny Littledoe, and Ken Hale and a couple of his students succeeded in reconstructing it from missionary texts and comparative evidence. And now it actually has its first native speaker in 100 years, Jesse's 5-year-old daughter. And it's revitalized the tribe. Other people are learning it. It's becoming a language again. It can be done. It's not easy, but the process of language leveling and disappearance is kind of like species disappearance. It's happening very fast. And it's, I think it's serious, quite a serious problem.
A few questions? Yes, another question.
Hello, Professor Chomsky. I'm a PhD in linguistics at the University of Ottawa. So I have a question about free merge. So if we suppose that merge is free, that is not constrained by selectional requirements, how do we predict that, or how do we stop things like T and little p, for example, from merging and then reaching the semantic interface where supposedly it shouldn't reach, right? Those kind of derivations should be ruled out before they reach the interfaces.
Well, I don't really agree that derivations ought to be ruled out before they reach the interface, especially when it's selectional. I mean, there are some cases, interesting cases, where it is ruled out just by crashing. So if features conflict, okay? So if you have, say, a singular a singular subject and a plural, we think of it as verb, but actually inflection. All right, that's going to be a conflict. So the man are here. Actually, I don't think even that should be ruled out. Those things are intelligible. You have to kind of work to think what they might mean. But violation of selectional restrictions is a pretty normal aspect of language use. In literature, in poetry, it's all over the place. A violation of it gives you metaphors, for example, which are normal in language use. And these expressions have whatever meaning they do. Sometimes it takes an effort of thought, of mind, to try to assign an interpretation to them. But that's part of the process of reading complex literature. So if you take a look at literary studies of poetry, for example, like William Empson's famous 7 Types of Ambiguity, like 50 years ago, a lot of it is concerned with how poetry simplifies things to the point where you just can't understand it unless you impose a substantial amount of interpretation. And that's the point of it. It's to make you think and interpret and imagine and so on. And selectional violations have that property too. So why rule them out? They have whatever meaning they have.
So the last question, please.
Thank you. I have a question regarding the article you co-authored in 2002 regarding the FLN-FLB distinction. I was wondering whether you could say a word about recursion and whether you still endorse or not the recursion-only hypothesis for FLN.
Well, actually, that article didn't actually say that. A lot of people haven't read anything beyond the abstract And a lot of the literature on that article just keeps to the abstract, okay? And the abstract does say that. But if you go into the article, it doesn't say that. It says what we're proposing is to be unique about human language is pretty much what I said today. Some computational process which is recursive, meaning it yields an infinite array of structured expressions, and the mappings to the interfaces, okay? That means to the semantic and the phonetic interface. Today I'd say it differently, so I wouldn't quite say that, because I think the mapping, at that time we thought it was symmetrical, but now it seems to me evidence is mounting that it's asymmetrical, that the design of language is oriented toward the thought system, and the sound side or the sign side or whatever modality it is peripheral for the peripheral act of externalization. But apart from that, I think it's right. Also, that article says something else, which nobody seems to have noticed. There are other things that seem to be unique to language. I didn't mention them today. If you look at a language, a combinatorial system has atomic units, smallest units, which then are put together. The smallest units for language are sort of word-like things, not actually words, but small meaning-bearing elements, concepts, if you like. The concepts of human thought are radically different from those of any animal system that we know. And how they evolved is a complete mystery. But they're obviously there. I mean, no time to go into it, but they're quite different. So, for example, a common belief is, another dogma, is what's sometimes called the referentialist doctrine, that the words of language refer to objects that are extramental, non-mental. So say the word desk, refers to some object that a physicist could identify, or cow refers to some object that could be identified, individuated, without reference to the mind. And that is the way animal signal systems work. But human language just doesn't work like that, not in the least. As soon as you start thinking about it, you see that all of that collapses. And where that came from, I think, remains a total mystery. So to go back to the first question, if there's any insight into that in the next 50 years, it'll be a real contribution. But that's another thing. That's mentioned in the article, not pursued. But the basic changes that personally I would make are, one, to divorce mapping to the sensory motor interface from the central position it had there, and to maintain the asymmetry I was talking about, and also to emphasize maybe more the fact that the base elementary concepts of language simply have no evolutionary origin that we know of. They came from somewhere, obviously, but nobody knows anything about them. And it isn't investigated because there's a lot of dogmas. Dogmas, for example, like the referentialist dogma. And until people are able to get to the point of being puzzled about those dogmas, we're not going to have any progress. We have millennia of the natural sciences to illustrate that, where there's virtually no progress because scientists just accepted what looked obvious as being obvious. And it almost never is. As soon as you look at it carefully, it's not obvious at all. It's very puzzling. And then you begin to raise questions about the simplest things, like why, if I'm holding a cup with steam in it, and I let go, why does the cup fall and the steam rise? And it's pretty puzzling when you think about it. And as soon as, say, Galileo was willing to be puzzled, you get modern science. That just hasn't happened in the human sciences, barely. And until that happens, we're not going to really have progress.
Professor Chomsky, we thank you for this interesting talk. Thank you very much.